Throughout their deep and rich history, Nintendo has very much made a name for themselves with family-friendly IPs that appeal to all ages and demographics. The average Nintendo game is lighthearted, approachable, and very clear in its intentions of being an overall fun time above everything else. Even when their titles sporadically delve into more serious tones or aesthetics, they still mostly carry that patented whimsical charm that is synonymous with the brand. There is simply a certain consistency in everything from the jovial adventures in the Mushroom Kingdom to Hyrule's expansive green fields. But in the vast space of iconic Nintendo franchises, it's undeniable that Metroid sticks out from the rest. The tone and presentation of Metroid goes against the mold that we so commonly see with popular Nintendo games. There is little room for whimsy, no place for wacky shenanigans. There is only you in a hostile world that hardly cares for your survival. The interstellar adventures of the series are clearly steeped in the influences of 70s and 80s sci-fi horror movies, like The Thing, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and most notably, Alien, which shows in everything from scenarios and monster design to themes and music. It's all about claustrophobic environments, both in the literal sense of the dark and damp caverns that you traverse, but simultaneously the crushing vastness of space weighing down on you. Even the few times where other non-hostile characters are present, it still feels intimately lonely. At their core, the mainline Metroid games are 2D platform explorations that rarely deviate from this framework when telling their narratives. Majority of the playtime will be spent jumping and shooting, but the themes are still constantly present through aesthetic presentation that is felt from the broad strokes to the small details. One of the most distinct qualities of establishing that iconic Metroid mood is how in every game, except Super for whatever reason, room has been given in the soundscapes for Samus's footsteps, echoing through the solitude of the dark and empty corridors that no human has ever set foot in before, punctuating both the player's presence, but also the non-presence of anyone else. With every step, Metroid re-emphasizes your place in its world and the ramifications of it. This is you. You are here. There is no one else. Remember this, it will be important later. Of course, this isn't something new or surprising. The idea that Metroid games rest on a foundation of loneliness and isolation is the accepted committee response on what the identity of the franchise is. Ask anyone what Metroid conveys and this is it, in equal footing with how the world design structures the game mechanics. The series has a mood and atmosphere of space solitude. The player engagement is centered around overcoming this by growing stronger. As such, the other side of the Metroid coin is all about freedom, choice, and conquest through exploration. These are ideas present since the very first game, further emphasized in the seminal Super Metroid, and since then, commonly accepted adjectives to describe the entire franchise. Again, ask anyone. Through this pretty rudimentary perception of the games, we understand that Metroid as a series has a popular narrative of what it is and is meant to be. The primordial Metroid game, Metroid, still to this day dictates the Metroid identity to an almost shocking degree. There's very little that has been subtracted since the series' inception, with enemies, power-ups, environments, and premise remaining intact throughout the last 35 years. Rather than allowing the series to evolve into something completely different, Nintendo have seemingly used this first game as the core idea of Metroidness, to presumably stay true to their roots. But with that said, once in a while a franchise like Metroid will look back at its rigid formula, question itself and do the impossible. It will become self-aware of this structure, and with that insight, take a striking proposition. Is this right? Is this all there is to it? Is this what I should be? Or rather, what I have become? And with that, take a bold new step forward into the unknown, to rupture its foundations and see whole new possibilities. But to truly explore that concept, we need to be thorough, meticulous, perhaps even a bit obnoxious. So let's go back to the very start. Let's explore the themes and narratives, how they evolved, were perfected, and finally corrupted into a pale husk of its former self. Let's find out the truth about Metroid. Looking back on it today, it's obvious that the very first Metroid game was a notable part of the Nintendo Entertainment System's lineup, a position that it then has withheld throughout the years. Most early games for the system were arcade-like single-screen score hunts, made for short spurts of engagement. In this climate, Super Mario Bros. Stuck out as grandiose and technically impressive with its numerous side-scrolling worlds. It opened up the virtual play space and broadened the possibilities of what a game could be. Similarly, The Legend of Zelda introduced an open world beyond what segmented levels could provide. With this in mind, it makes a lot of sense that a game like Metroid would further expand on those prospects by merging the openness of Zelda with the movement of Mario. Like we said, at its core, it's a simple side-scrolling platforming game, but it presents the player with a massive world that has to be traversed in all possible directions. There are no levels to speak of, no fades to black before entering a new area. It's all one cohesive map to find yourself lost in. The alien organic looking tunnels of planet Sebes feel uncanny and grand, almost larger than life. The game even introduced the password system, emphasizing that the world was so huge that it required several play sessions to fully explore. And with that, it's clear how Metroid, together with its sibling titles Mario and Zelda, helped to define what the home console video game experience was. It replaced the short arcade spurts with long-form adventures, where the goal at hand was more important than a high score. Beyond the concept of the open-ended world, Metroid is of course distinct in other ways as well. Whereas Zelda was a grand fantasy epic and Mario was a working-class power trip, Metroid was a science fiction action game with subtle elements of horror. Just the look of the game in itself is evocative. You have the barren environments with the large black backgrounds, an ever-present nothingness looming over you. And while it's true that most early NES games used the black background for contrast or just limitations, it absolutely works in this case to create an atmosphere. It's small things like walking into an empty corridor and hearing that mysterious item room melody, only to be met by some arcane ancient statue presenting you with a new and important ability. Metroid doesn't just drop power-ups on you willy-nilly, it makes it a ceremony of anticipation. It has pacing and breathing room. Just taking the elevators are trips in themselves, where the next area is first felt through some new eerie piece of music. The game certainly knows how to create mood and tension, which applies equally for its sequel. Metroid 2: The Return of Samus puts even greater emphasis on atmosphere and, similarly to the original, lets the world speak for itself through soundscapes and visuals. It ditches the colorful palettes for monochrome vistas that instantly sets a dark and eerie tone. And even if you manage to score yourself a Game Boy Color to get those fancier colors, the damp caverns of SR388 still feel just as cold and unwelcoming as before. The camera is pulled in closer and intensifies the already claustrophobic ambience of the planet by limiting your field of view, Where the first game had very understated music, the second goes even further in the direction of minimalism, barely bothers with what could be considered melodies, and focuses hard on environmental sounds. The echoes of unseen creatures in the far distance, the unnerving noises of the unknown, with only your heavy footsteps accompanying them. It's like a Game Boy field recording. It's remarkably oppressive. Some would probably argue that this is all simply a result of the limitations of the Game Boy, making it impossible for the creators to entirely bring their true vision to fruition. But we don't think that is entirely true. At the very least, it kind of undermines the achievements of this absolute classic. The visuals and sounds of Metroid 2 are of course bound to the capabilities of the Game Boy, but they use the limitations of the hardware to their benefit, and we'd like to think that the end result is very much intentional and not just an unfortunate compromise. In fact, we'd even go so far to say that this little Game Boy game managed to nail that feeling of isolation and loneliness that so many would pin as the identity of the entire franchise better than any of the others. It's pretty much textbook Metroid at its finest. It's really interesting to examine and play Metroid and its sequel today because of their different approaches to the same basic concept. They're strikingly familiar and at the same time distant from what we're used to. That is just an effect of them actively creating the Metroid playbook, but it's remarkable nonetheless. There's an apparent strive towards conveying several core ideas through these games that are both enhanced and further explored, actively using the strengths and weaknesses of their respective systems, in a time where that wasn't very obvious. Hell, it had barely been done before. These games were pioneers of aesthetic theming, creating living, breathing game worlds that were more than just obstacle courses, and building an atmosphere like it was no one's business. But despite them being certified classics, meaningful to the overarching gaming canon, all that junk, they are still surprisingly overlooked, and we'd even argue that they are quite unreasonably maligned. With remakes of them both available to play instead, it is somewhat understandable that these two games would be considered easy to skip, and not worth even bothering with. But how some people talk about them in regards to the entire franchise, you'd think these games were some kind of Lovecraftian horrors that are impossible to play with hands made in the 2000s. In fact, a lot of people and a handsome blue Muppet seem to be so adamant about this truth that they don't even have to play them at all to make that judgment.
I've never played it, and I don't plan on doing so.
And fair enough, I suppose. But I don't know about you. Doesn't that feel just a little bit unfair? Sure, they're old archaic games and you're not really forced to play them, of course, but it doesn't seem like they even got a chance to prove themselves to be anything else. And look, this is not coming from a weirdly righteous sense of nostalgia. We didn't grow up with the original Metroid nor Metroid 2. In fact, we didn't finish them until long after their relevance. We don't even have the physical copies to flaunt in this on-screen section. Can you believe it? We just genuinely think that these games aren't as inaccessible and horribly arcane as they have been made out to be. The first two games are undoubtedly important. They form the foundation of the entire franchise and are what later games truly harken from. But of course, things aren't really that simple, because in actuality, the true model for the series is Super Metroid. We all know this, it's Metroid 101, and it's not hard to see why Super Metroid is so highly revered. It's like an epiphany, heightening the concept to a whole new level. With this said, it's important to note that a game like Super Metroid doesn't just happen without the groundwork laid by the first two games. Like, of course this game is good, just look at its parents. Although, the way Super Metroid relies on its predecessors is often severely understated, apart from like a lore connection or whatever. It takes all of the conclusions reached by the previous games, repackages them, and presents them again in a more conventional, attractive format. Functionally, this game is a remake of the first one, using its metatextual retreads to reinstate some form of new continuity. Super feels definitive because it frames both its many derivative elements and the new ideas as equally novel and exciting. It's one of the first true examples we can think of where a video game revisits areas and scenarios in a nostalgically evocative way that's both unsettling and subversive. Things like the return to the starting area of the first game, the fake baby Kraid, the mock droids, or when the mother brain confrontation just takes a completely left turn. We don't think it's particularly controversial to say that these moments only fully function with knowledge of prior games, to understand what they're pointing towards. It's actively designed around this idea. Yet, at the same time, when viewed in a broader context, Super Metroid seemingly demands it be taken as its own entity. It's the soft reboot for the franchise, bringing players up to speed in its introduction and then reenacting the mythos of what constituted the first game. You don't need to play the first two games because Super successfully managed to substitute them. And this isn't just some funky idea of viewing the games in some meta perspective. That's just what people do. A lot of players have started with Super because it's the most approachable and culturally legitimized. This is what Super Metroid does best, stealing the traits of its progenitors and brutally murdering them in the process. My god, Super Metroid, what have you done? In other words, it's too good. When talking about Super Metroid, it's easy to gush about how it made navigation and traversal more easily readable, expanded the versatility of the moveset, streamlined the whole experience, or how the theatricality of its cutscenes are constantly stated as an important step for storytelling in video games. However, for the subject we're getting to in this video, we feel it's more important to talk about how Super Metroid furthers those thematic aesthetics, and how it punctuates the then ongoing narrative of the games. If the horror elements of the series were understated and inferred in the first two games, they are presented with the subtlety of a bulldozer in Super. Just the title screen in itself is like a statement, using hasty cuts between close-ups to introduce itself, with the visual of the solitary Metroid larva in an abandoned space lab environment. The horror angle is obvious, and the present indicator is shockingly gruesome for its context. This is a Nintendo game that opens with the view of dead, bloody bodies. It's undeniably trying to elicit something here. Clearly. This is a game that consistently plays with horror through already established keywords like loneliness and isolation, by expanding those ideas to new logical levels. You are small in this hostile world. You confront monsters larger than the screen, and venture into increasingly desolate areas like the abandoned ghost ship or the dreary Meridia. A nightmare in more than one sense of the word. This element has often been downplayed in favor of its countermeasure, the idea of triumph. Like any game in the series, you grow stronger and overcome your opposition, but this is only after the world in itself states your limitations for you, glimpsing places that are currently inaccessible to you and sometimes even locking you inside an area until you're strong enough to leave. The hostility of the world is as ever present as the ambience and anticipation of the quieter moments. It's what makes the game so appealing to explore and overcome. Continuing, this is the first Metroid game that really places an emphasis on spelling out the narrative at hand by more than just a mission blurb. Granted, it's still very minimal, but it marks a point where the series has become self-conscious enough to address the repetitive nature of itself. In fact, the whole story of the game is seemingly about stopping a recursion of the first game by blatantly repeating it. For the uninitiated, the Metroid franchise is usually presented as having a complex overarching story, and we'll get into this more later, but for the moment, we can only renounce that statement. It's not very complicated. It can be jotted down on a napkin, and this is not a bad thing. It just is. Basically, in the first Metroid game, you play as alleged space hunter Samus Aran, tasked by the Galactic Federation to go to planet Sebes, which is the base of the space pirate organization. These guys, presumably led by Mother Brain, Ridley and Kraid, have obtained a batch of parasitic lifeforms dubbed Metroids, bioweapons found in the ruins of an ancient civilization. It is Samus' task to go down to the planet, defeat the pirate leaders, and liquidate the Metroids, which is accomplished by blowing everything up. This is the archetypical Metroid story, which is always derived from in some way. This is the framework where all the tropes come from. In this first game, it's played the most straight it's ever been and ever will. Metroid is a game where you play as a funny ball lady punching bad guys with a gun. When you win, they all die in spectacular glory. This is an unquestionably good thing. But already in the second game, this dynamic is somewhat questioned. Granted, it's by baby steps, but it's still pointing towards a firm conclusion. In the wake of the space pirates having threatened the galaxy with the Metroids, the space government assigns Samus on a cleaner mission, where she departs for the Metroid homeworld SR-388 to exterminate them all, for ensured peace and prosperity of course. From the get-go, this game is a lot more harsh with the presented means. The Metroids are overtly animal-like in stark contrast with the space pirates that presumably operate under some guise of agency. The threat isn't that these creatures endanger the galaxy, it's that they could potentially be used in that way again. Thanks to the minimalist presentation of the game, what with the given format, you are placed on a planet immediately from the title screen, ready to start your mission. It's confrontative and distant. You're just playing a game about systemic eradication. The power balance here is non-existent, the ramifications absolute. Yet, in its final moments, Metroid 2 dares to oppose its own narrative and ask a simple question. Is this right? After every Metroid is dead, the species extinct, Samus encounters a newly hatched larva and hesitates. Through a game that's focused all around killing, the conclusion is to ultimately cease the violence in the 11th hour. In this scene, both Samus and the Metroid series are for the first time granted a sense of individuality, acting independently from the powers that be. Samus has been made out as a heroic fighter for good, the defender of the galaxy, but her choices have led her down a darker path, killing as a precautionary measure by declaration of absolute evil. Why is this game called The Return of Samus? Is it because it's the second game? Or because she quite literally gains a semblance of humanity and a return to her senses through it? It's probably the former, but regardless, it marks a firm point where Metroid can no longer be interpreted in blacks and whites. Samus has her own sense of morality that is presented as distinct from the other factions in the narrative, and this will only become increasingly important going forward. With this, we arrive at Super Metroid, which picks up right where the last game left off. Samus hands over the preserved Metroid larva to scientific research, and isn't even halfway out the door before Ridley pops up and steals it, resulting in a chase back to planet Sebes. Familiar beats are repeated as Samus searches the planet for the stolen hatchling, only to rediscover it at the very end, where it sacrifices itself to protect Samus from the mecha dinosaur Mother Brain. A self-destruct sequence is initiated, Samus escapes to her spaceship and the whole planet blows up. No more Metroids, they're all dead, series over for like a decade. When played in order, and considering proximity of release, it makes sense to lump these 3 first games into some form of initial treatise on what the Metroid series is about. It has a beginning, middle, and end, where a framework is presented, problematized, and then revisited with gained knowledge and experience. Important is Samus' growing individuality and independent morality. At first, she takes jobs from the government to instigate violence, but by the end, she confronts these same evils by her own sense of duty. The existence of Metroids have been problematized and a clear hierarchy of agency established. These creatures are used as tools by malign forces, and they are the bad guys that you need to punch with a gun. The involvement and ultimate demise of Metroids in this squabble is presented as tragic. There was no place for them in this world, because they were inherently a vessel for war and destruction. Conclusively, there's been a process here to explore all the involved parties and define their true nature. Samus is self-righteous and independent, the space pirates unfalteredly evil, and the Metroids mindlessly neutral. Killing the space pirates is still unquestionably good, while exterminating the Metroids may be a bit excessive, although it seems their demise is also ultimately good because
the galaxy is at peace.
This is the extent of morality presented in the foundational Metroid games. One moment of hesitation to give us the idea that Samus has limits, and an otherwise ceaseless barrage of violence until there's nothing left in existence that can be construed as a bad guy. Samus' journey for peace is probably more ironic than these games are willing to admit. We now understand that a Metroid game is about a fear of the unknown and a conquest of it. You are free and independent within that framework to go wherever you want and do whatever you want. To fully explore that alien world and gain the strength you need to overcome it. Because ultimately, you are justified in doing so. After the release of Super Metroid, the series took a whopping 8-year hiatus, in which an entire console generation was skipped over. During that wait, the medium was evolving rapidly, and when it was finally time for the 4th entry, Metroid Fusion, the video game landscape had significantly changed forever. Technological advancements meant that the handheld Game Boy now could keep up with the Super Nintendo, making it a perfect fit for a better aesthetic cohesion with Super Metroid. Additionally, game design ideas had progressed quite a bit as well, key factors being a more prominent focus on narratives, and to some returning veterans' chagrin, player guidance. While the game did garner a positive reception at the time, it has managed to become more divisive over the years. The most telling sign of Fusion's popular status is how, despite being the obvious successor to Super, it clearly did not replace it at all. On surface level, Metroid Fusion is a more linear and restrictive experience than its predecessors. The player is pointed in the right direction, is constantly briefed on their objectives, and the world is more segmented, making it better suited for playing in bite-sized chunks, like one might with a portable game. Today, linearity is somewhat of a dirty word, and Metroid Fusion has simply become a victim of that notion. It is not necessarily a better approach, but neither is it worse. It's simply different. Which makes sense for a franchise that was kinda trying to reinvent and re-establish itself. So while some might think that Metroid Fusion has been compromised by being more easily approachable, that the game is being too handholdy and doesn't have much faith in the player's own abilities, we think that is far from the truth. And not just in the sense that it is still pretty challenging, it also allows for a lot of freedom and exploration, just in a new way. Surprisingly enough, by being more linear, Metroid Fusion is actually given a lot of opportunities to be more intricate with its environments, where it can funnel players into problems to solve and steeper roadblocks to overcome. The game has a great understanding of how to let the player loose in smaller maps and letting them figure out how to progress on their own. It's like a series of neat microcosms of Metroid exploration. To us, the way Metroid Fusion distances itself from the Metroid mold are not detrimental. It's still highly enjoyable in a familiar way, but that distancing is also the key factor in why this game just works so fantastically on an entirely different level. As mentioned earlier, the general proximity of the first three games helped to distinguish them as a coherent unit, the classic Metroid trilogy that forms the foundation of the entire franchise. In that system, Fusion is strikingly new and radical in its ideas and approach. There has certainly been plenty of time for the developers to reflect on Metroid as a whole, and this shows not only in the updated game mechanics, but primarily in the messaging where previous ideas of morality and responsibility that had only been inferred before are brought out into broad daylight. The narrative is an exhibition of Metroid's nasty inner workings, interlinking its new restrictive format with complicated revelations to make an experience that is consequently uncomfortable in every facet of its being. Fucking fantastic, really, but we are getting ahead of ourselves. Metroid Fusion picks up sometime after Super Metroid, where on a scientific expedition on the old Metroid homeworld SR-388, a highly contagious organism called the X-Parasite is discovered and brought on board a space station orbiting the planet. Having been infected and properly vaccinated with Metroid DNA, Samus is the only person capable of going to the station for investigation when the X-Parasites unsurprisingly break out. There, she discovers a government conspiracy to not only breed Metroids, but also the intentions of capturing the X-Parasites for their own benefits. Realizing that her contractors are just as corrupt and malign as the space pirates, and completely unable to understand the dangers of the powers they're toying with, Samus breaks loose from her duty and blows up the space station together with the planet, negating the possibility for anyone to ever use the Metroids or X-Parasites as weapons again. Samus is now de facto the last Metroid. The original purpose of the Metroids has been revealed, the government unmasked and crisis permanently averted in gruesomely dramatic fashion. Until this point, a Metroid game revolved around a simple premise of descending on a planet, efficiently eradicating threats, and then bailing the heck out of there when the whole place explodes. No questions asked. Samus was just a space hunter out for a bounty, a contractual obligation one might say, and the player was never truly given much reason to think about the implications of their actions on any deeper level than it being fun to punch disgusting alien creatures with a gun. It was uncomplicated. Metroid Fusion flips that narrative on its head, puts Samus's actions in perspective, and finally starts doing the real questioning. When Samus returns to the planet where she triumphantly defeated the Metroid threat once and for all, the consequences of those actions hit her directly. And hard. Turns out that you can't just exterminate an entire species without upsetting the ecosystem where it lived. You see, the Metroids had a purpose other than being mindless killing machines used for war and conquest, as they were in fact the natural predator of the dangerous organisms that now courses through Samus's entire body. Oops! The repercussions she experiences firsthand almost ends her life. And while she is miraculously saved, it is not without great turmoil, as the revelation leaves her vulnerable and scarred. Samus mentioning being reborn as something new after the procedures doesn't just refer to the fancy new getup she rocks in the game. She has been shaken to her very core by the event. She almost died because of what she ultimately did in Metroid 2. It's the kind of acknowledgement that would change someone to the point of no return. Both the old power suit and the new fusion suit are highly important thematically though, as they represent the past and present respectively, as well as the disconnect between the two. It's fitting then that the X-Parasites that infected Samus turn into what is referred to as SAX, a copy of Samus as she was by the end of Super Metroid, suit and all, an absolute force of nature that destroys everything in her path with no remorse. She is, in other words, quite literally being haunted by a specter of her past self that can eradicate her just as ruthlessly as she did her own enemies. SAX is the embodiment of those consequences. It's an ugly reflection of the protagonist that puts the franchise's previous entries in perspective. There is a delightful poetic quality to how the original balance of Metroids and X-Parasites was unknowingly undone by Samus, leaving her in a position as the last living carrier of the Metroid gene, now stalked by those same X-Parasites, embodying her destructive past self. The hunter has truly become the hunted in more ways than one. The doppelganger is a common trope for video games. The dark shadow of the hero is, after all, a very compelling one. But it's hard to find a more perfect example of its use than Metroid Fusion. Apart from the purely thematic angle, SAX is effective in how it plays into those pre-established ideas of loneliness and solitude the series is known for, while also intersecting them with the familiar horror qualities of the series. This is the closest Metroid gets to being cold sweat pants peeing scary, and it's not just because this entity is impossibly stronger and more capable than you. It's because it breaks both the dynamic of how Metroid is played and the player's sense of self. As we talked about in the beginning, one aspect of the sound design that's 95% consistent throughout the entire franchise is the player's movement being punctuated by their own footsteps. They emphasize your place within the game world, creates a sense of space, and helps maintain a system where you are the only real individual walking these dark caverns. None of the monsters really traverse the world like you do. You're the killer of foes, opener of doors, and rider of elevators. But then, everything changes. As a dark copy of Samus, SAX does not just look like her, it's deeper than that. This is a subversion of the player avatar. It's something that interacts with the environments in similar ways as they do. This is signaled through the chillingly iconic sound of the opening of a door and the echoing sound of footsteps. The presence of someone else. For a game series that's built on that idea of loneliness, something so simple like another being is extremely unsettling. It desperately makes you yearn back to that blissful solitude again, a comfort in a lesser horror. As the saying goes, you're not scared of being alone, you're scared of not being alone. And in a way, it's striking how well this entire idea plays into the overarching theme of Metroid Fusion. Not just how Samus's copy puts a new perspective on herself, it's how the idea that someone else would go around those corridors shooting and killing feels borderline perverted. That is your role, it's being stolen from you. But at the same time, you finally understand how messed up it really is. The majority of the enemies of Metroid games are just the fauna of the planet Samus explores, nothing more than animals. And when placed in that position yourself, SAX becomes indistinguishable from the real Samus. Just a cold-blooded murder machine with no remorse. And that revelation is a deeply uncomfortable one. That discomfort is a thematic through line in Metroid Fusion. It's constantly felt through the linear setup of reconvening at navigation rooms to progress further. Instead of getting lost in a sprawling organic world, you are instead forced into a rigid framework of short spurt missions in a man-made environment. It's sterile in more ways than just decoration. As mentioned before, this is probably the biggest contention for players, and is easily one interpreted as a measure to make the game more easily approachable, And fine, that is probably true to some extent. But as a break from the old norm, it works wonders in creating a whole new feel and manages to fully realize an emotional connection between player and narrative. Samus is a freelance contractor. Her characterization is built on being the toughest badass who's sent in when all other options are exhausted. Clearly, this whole formal business of taking orders is not clicking with her. The game emphasizes this again and again. It's meant to be jarring. Samus herself is annoyed. On a broader level, that linearity can be read as a claustrophobic recontextualization of the Metroid formula. Samus is in a pressured position and out of her comfort zone. It is a form of revelation in the same way the consequences of old deeds come back to haunt her. Previous Metroid games were presented to have an open structure, but under scrutiny, it's evident that the games not just guides the player into taking obvious routes, like Kraid before Ridley, but that progression to a large extent has been pre-scripted. Sure, post-credit scenes may show Samus in varying layers of clothing, but otherwise, the games always end the same. The path always reaches the same conclusion. The games are inherently a bit more linear than they make themselves out to be. And that's actively exposed by Metroid Fusion. You have as little choice as you've ever had. The explicit lack of freedom goes hand in hand with the more obvious concept of government control that is presented in Metroid Fusion. Throughout the game, Samus is being ordered around by a computer AI who she promptly calls Adam, after a late superior of hers. In coordination with the Galactic Federation, Adam tells Samus where she needs to go to complete her missions, and you regularly have to check in with the computer man as you carry on throughout the base. Samus is on their territory. They have full control over the situation she has found herself in. Every footstep she takes is monitored in scrutinizing detail to make sure that she doesn't walk off the beaten path. There are secrets on this base that not even a great hero is privy to, and this is especially important as it becomes more and more clear that Samus is being strung along by the Galactic Federation for their own benefits. They can't contain Samus though, as the troubles at the base puts her in situations where she must improvise and use her old thought process of creating new paths where there once were none. She picks up upgrades she wasn't meant to, opens locks beyond what she is allowed, and travels to places that were never meant for her eyes to see. And this escalates throughout the narrative. Until finally...
Warning, no entry without authorization.
Samus finds herself lost far away from the regular waymarkers and ends up in the most secret of locations in the entire research station. After having been pulled and pushed in all kinds of directions for the last few hours, a voice repeating, "No entry without authorization," calls out to you like a siren song. It's the ultimate betrayal of all the strict orders that have been given so far. This is where it finally becomes perfectly clear that something has been hidden from you all along, that you are just a pawn in a much bigger game. This is the culmination of Samus's relationship with the Galactic Federation. This is where she breaks free by opening one single door she's not supposed to. On the other side, Samus discovers that the space station has been used by the Galactic Federation to clone Metroids and evolve them rapidly in secrecy. Adam later tells Samus more about the allegedly peaceful Metroid War program, and asks her to
please understand.
But that is a hard pill to swallow, considering how these creatures have been used by powerful groups before. What the peaceful reasoning behind illegally cloning bioweapons and speeding up the revolutionary cycle is anyone's guess. Because I doubt they're planning on making some fun equivalent of Jurassic Park here. These are the same crimes that have previously been met with ultimate judgment. It has been presented as the epitome of evil actions. It's the reason why we kill them all in the first place. And yet, here you are, supposed to believe that the Federation isn't just as corruptible by power as anyone else. Because they clearly are, based on their actions. In hindsight, it makes a lot of sense that the Galactic Federation would be like this. Throughout the first 3 games, they are mostly in the background, without clear characterization. They're just a space government, you know, automatically assumed good in contrast to the evil space pirates. But were they? After all, they sent Samus on her missions. They structured that narrative of what was right and wrong for the galaxy. They had clear motives for instigating conflict with opposing factions. The whole reason you went to SR-388 was explicitly to negate anyone, the possibility of overthrowing them. At the end of Super Metroid, when peace is seemingly restored and the balance of good and evil absolute, the government is the most blatant hanging thread. You just didn't think about it until Fusion pointed it out with them repeating everything you tried to prevent in the first place. Even when the breeding facility detaches from the station and blows up, essentially leaving the problem dealt with, it is quickly revealed that the Federation has gotten their eyes on something else. Something much worse. They are looking to capture the SAX. Before Samus can even do anything with this information, Adam confines her to one of the navigation rooms. The Federation troopers are already on their way to the station. There is not much time. This is where the final pieces fall into place, as Samus confronts the computerized representation of her old Federation superior and tries to reason him into opening the doors and letting her stop the incoming catastrophe. It's the final confrontation with her past connections to the galactic government, as she opposes a much more personal relationship in the form of Adam. At first, he chastises her for her suggestions, seemingly confirming her thoughts about this machine as compassionless and obsessed with duty. But then his attitude changes. Much like her former mentor, the computer understands what needs to be done, and indeed defies the orders given to him. It is fitting then that Samus's final mission is given here, not by the Galactic Federation, but by an old friend. With her figurative chains unshackled, Samus is given free access to enter the operations room and adjust the propulsion system, plunging the research station into SR-388 with a massive explosion that wipes out all traces of the X-Parasites. She confronts and overcomes SAX, has a classic escape sequence, defeats a non-sequitur Omega Metroid, and rides off into safety. Considering the dominant themes of consequences and recklessness, the absolute overkill ending may come across as odd, maybe vapid even. Like a non-conclusion to everything that's been said. If Samus screwing up the ecosystem of SR-388 was a bad thing, then what is this? Of course, it makes sense as a last-ditch effort to eradicate the worst threat she's ever faced before, but what has been learned here? Perhaps the most sensible conclusion is a broader one, not looking at the actions in a diegetic sense, but as a game. Up until the very last minute, Metroid Fusion has questioned the very essence of Samus, exposed the ethical faults of the series and dug deep into revelations that cannot be unlearned, and it would seem that its finale would punctuate this in the most harsh way. But instead, Metroid resists its self-critique. Samus is once again given free control, agency to act on her own, and does this the only way she knows how to, by indulging in the core Metroid experience. You punch the bad guys with the gun, run from the base, get the hyper beam, shoot the Metroid, and blow the fuck out of everything. Metroid Fusion is a harsh view on the series, but it's equally a cleansing. At the end of the day, it takes all the narrative dilemmas, pushes them aside, and is allowed to accept itself. Metroid is good, Metroid is fine. It has problems, but ultimately, you're here to explore worlds and stop bad things from happening. At its conclusion, Samus reflects on the events that have just transpired, but perhaps it's not just a view of what happened in Fusion, but of all previous games as well. She contemplates about what others in the universe will think about these actions, how she and those involved will be held responsible for the atrocities that took place. But she's not asking for forgiveness or a right to be relieved of her sins. All she can do is hope that someone will understand. Samus accepts the fault of her actions, the ramifications of having done the things she did. She has her own justifications, and as long as that remains true, she can move forward. She honestly sounds a bit like a transparency video when she waxes on about her big-brained understanding of the past. I mean, just listen to this shit. We're all bound by our experiences. They are the limits of our consciousness. It's uncanny. Ultimately, this is the sort of conclusion Metroid Fusion must logically come to, considering it's part of a never-ending multimedia franchise. Yet, even within that system, the game is surprisingly bold with its statements. It turns the series' core philosophies inside out in ways that are probably too inquisitive for a Nintendo product, and it gets away with it. But what Fusion shows is final. It's a perspective that cannot be unmade. In the opening, Samus talks about being reborn in some sense, which one might say applies to the game as a whole. It's a long process exploring the boundaries of Metroid, leaving the old innocent worldview of the original games behind. At the end, Samus absorbs the powers of SAX, finally reuniting with that old, damaged and discarded self. She grows powerful, sure, but she's not the same. Because she cannot be. That journey of soul-searching has been made and closed the door behind Samus. The only path forward is one of self-conscious maturity. This applies equally for the Metroid series. Through Fusion, the inner workings are exposed, and while the conclusion indeed rediscovers its footing as an indulgent, heroic sci-fi adventure, things can never truly be the same again. Metroid Fusion is a metamorphosis, a sort of midlife crisis for the series. It's easy to imagine Sakamoto and the gang feeling restricted by the increasingly narrow framework they had to fit their narratives into. The first two games were mostly made by people who went on to other projects, leaving a minimal story of awkward absolutes and little questioning. It's pretty telling how the second game in this franchise was about completely exterminating its namesake. They weren't exactly planning ahead there. The one tangible heart at the core of those games was Samus's show of restraint, and it makes sense that this is what they expanded upon. First through a game exploring that connection with the baby, and then the consequences of shooting first and asking questions later. In this meta angle, Metroid Fusion is satisfyingly poetic. Being produced a decade after the old games, the narrative feels like an aging person living with the recklessness of their youth, gaining knowledge with time, knowledge that complicates the labor of carefree days, and finding those actions irreversible. The only resort is to add that context yourself, make a new work that addresses those philosophical problems and ease your heart, carve out your own redemption. But while we think Fusion is really clever, handsome and cool, we're not going to pretend like the revelation that the space government is actually the bad guy could be considered a new and original idea. I mean, it is basically just the plot of Alien, but with more steps to get to the same conclusion. It's a bit surprising that Nintendo would allow them to take those bits from Alien, but narratively, it's not really mind-blowing stuff, so to speak. It does, however, present the audience with a lot to think about regarding the entire series. It might even blow some holes in the structure of this figurative spaceship, if you will. Like, was the galaxy ever truly at peace? Did the space government have the plan to clone Metroids from the very moment they got their hands on the last one? Or even before that? Did they order the extermination of the Metroid species because they didn't want anyone else but themselves to have them? How long have they been researching this stuff anyway? What about the space pirates? Did they have good reasons to be in conflict with the Federation? Is that the name of their race? Or is it just government propaganda to make them seem inherently like evil criminals? After all, space pirates imply the existence of regular pirates. I mean, at this point you have to consider which of the factions have the most power and resources to begin with here. The space pirates are just a flying dragon man and a bunch of crabs who operate a stolen computer from the damp caverns of a remote planet somewhere. What's the difference between space pirates and Sebesians? It would make sense if the space pirates are just a subgroup of the Sebesians, but according to the Metroid wiki, which seems really confused about this, it's the other way around, and also the space pirates in the Prime games are not the same space pirates as the ones in the main series. Apparently the Sebesians or the space pirate, whichever you want, who the fuck knows, are just really stupid creatures that need to be subjugated to a powerful leader to even function, even though they can clearly build and fly spaceships with their crabby little hands. Like, this has to be a lie, right? Sebesians are clearly intelligent enough for things like space travel, cloning, cybernetics, weapons manufacturing, once all the Sebesians are all dead. Anyway, this shows that we're also anti-vaxxers, because instead of using the Metroid DNA to develop a vaccine that makes you completely immune to the X-Parasites, they instead made freaking monsters out of the same goo to combat the threat, which is a pretty weird way to solve the problem. How does the Metroid vaccine even work anyway? You don't just inject dog plasma and become immune to cats. That doesn't even make any sense. And while all this is very confusing, I guess this is as good of a place as any to talk about.
My past is not a memory.
Never tell yourself it's gonna be a short video and then start talking about every single Metroid game. Why do we keep doing this? Why am I still here? So far, we have only touched upon what is being explicitly stated in the games themselves, which is the most straightforward and arguably best way to experience the story of Metroid. Because once you start to dabble in the supplementary material and the stuff that is being said in the myriad of side games, then suddenly things take a turn for the worse. Let us try to explain what we mean. Metroid Fusion upended the overarching Metroid universe a lot, and in many ways, there is a certain finality to it. The series' namesake has been destroyed once more, only truly living on through Samus, who herself has faced her own past, come out on the other end enlightened, while the Galactic Federation has been exposed as corrupt and power-hungry, as so many others before them. It's a tough game to follow up precisely because it isn't just another return to the status quo, like Nintendo is so used to with their other franchises. And this clearly presented a problem for them when they then tried to continue making the series. In the public consciousness, Fusion wasn't the obvious next step from Super Metroid. It was a transformative alternative take on the series that probably came off as secondary to the definitive Super, which creates a problem. Because of its unfaltering popularity, Super Metroid became the measuring stick that all former and later Metroid games are now compared to. In that sense, it's not surprising that it has never been critically surpassed, because no game will ever be more Super Metroid than Super Metroid. This is good for endlessly hammering home the game as the bestest Metroid, but by doing so, it presents a dead end, and the regressive foil to Metroid Fusion. It seems no progress was actually made from Fusion. Instead, all eyes reverted back to Super Metroid for inspiration, when the franchise was then renewed for the next generation. Despite its best efforts, the narrative of Fusion was ignored, with Nintendo instead spending the next 2 decades trying to flesh out the universe, while just walking backwards. Up until this point, the narrative of the Metroid games sort of evolved naturally as the series progressed, revealing more small tidbits to the players seemingly as they were discovered in the game universe itself. The Chozo, for example, were never mentioned by name until Super Metroid, before that only referred to as an unknown ancient civilization. And even then, it was very unclear how they were related to the Metroids, only vaguely implied by the statues and ruins of planet SR388. Like it's in the very back of the Metroid Fusion manual that it's revealed that it only recently has come to light that the Chozo indeed created the Metroids. What we're trying to say is basically that the series has always been retconning things, even from the very beginning. Samus went from being a cyborg to just wearing a cybernetic suit, and Ridley was a mind-controlled inhabitant of planet Sebes before becoming the actual space pirate leader, to name a few. But it never really felt like retconning, because the games and their manuals were surprisingly consistent, to the point where most of the changes and additions felt like a small mystery untangling in front of you, rather than being tacked on bullshit. With the release of Fusion, the floodgates of narrative possibilities for the series were opened. Essentially, the franchise was soft rebooted once more and entered a new era with further adjustments to the status quo. Perhaps the most violently egregious addition is the revelation that Samus was actually raised by the Chozo after Ridley and his space pirate gang killed her parents. This was a small lore snippet that had floated around in some form previously, but it was only by the turn of the millennium that it was explicitly enforced on the franchise. Now, the Chozo had raised Samus, trained her in their bird martial arts, and infused her with their own blood, making her super special awesome unlike any other stupid human. The main point is, however, that the Chozo went from being a mysterious ancient civilization that was wiped out a long time ago, seemingly by their own hubris, to becoming the space hippies who lived next door a week ago and we haven't heard from them in a while. Someone should probably go check on them. So it turns out that Samus is not just a really cool space hunter who does jobs quickly and efficiently, but she's also intimately connected to every single faction that we know of in the entire Metroid universe. It's cool that Samus has two dads and all, but it really makes everything feel so convenient and microscopic compared to the unknown of before. But you may wonder, where did all of this come from if not from the games? A few of you will understandably point to the manga that ran from 2003 to 2004, but that's not at all where this comes from. It's rather an adaptation of an adaptation. Truth be told, there have been plenty of tie-in Metroid comics throughout the years, like the one where Samus is lesbian or the one where Kraid is trans. But most important is the American Nintendo Power comic adaptation of Super Metroid from 1994. This is the first place where we see the narrative of the K2L orphan taken under the wing of the Chozo. Like, really. This is it. A Nintendo Power comic about a guy eating hamburgers is the official origin of the expanded Metroid lore. So, was this based on some design document from the developers? I mean, hardly, considering they didn't even send a ref sheet for how Samus looks. The writing and illustration was all done by one dude, Benimaru Ito. It's evident that he took what little was there in the games and tried to adapt it as well as he could, adding some personal flares and interpretations. And apparently, that was good enough to form the entire Metroid design bible. Wow. Okay. A couple months later, Benimaru Ito returned to re-illustrate this for the Japanese Super Metroid guidebook, and after that, it was apparently just an established thing. What we can infer from this is that while the Super Metroid comic isn't necessarily canon, it absolutely forms the backbone of Samus's backstory. It's all there, it's undeniable. And could there be a more beautiful testament to how much of a hodgepodge all of this is? Half-baked pulp slop that not even the fans take seriously. You'd absolutely be excused if you didn't assume that this was among the most important pieces of foundational Metroid media out there, because in this format, it could even be considered a bit too obscure. For all intents and purposes, this was non-existent in the games up until this point, so considering that, one might think that it's not necessarily 100% conclusive. It was first featured in a game context through the Super Smash Bros. Series of all places, later mentioned in the Metroid Prime manual, non-verbally inferred in the Japanese version of Fusion, and finally, readapted as that Japan-only manga. Overall, pretty vague stuff that you could easily miss. And it's safe to say that it took a while for it to even be accepted as a part of the games. However, Metroid Zero Mission, a remake of the original Metroid, was the first game to present this front and center to the extent where no one could get away from it anymore, adding several flashbacks and clear implications that all of this is indeed true, just shoehorning in that fact like it had always been there from the very beginning. But that is hardly the case, and it really shows. The ancient civilization, their strange technology, and the ruins they left behind scattered across the planet Samus visits throughout the series speaks of quite a different story. A mysterious one that there might never be an answer to. Their demise perhaps left as a warning for future civilizations to not be consumed by progress, power, or whatever other vice that fits with the overarching Metroid universe. Space is enigmatic, vast, and the possibilities out there are more numerous than we can possibly envision. Metroid really invoked that feeling of uncertainty, precisely because it was so unexplored and left the figurative pieces for you to only imagine. The early Metroid games were certainly a case for the old saying that sometimes less is more. And that's why it's especially disheartening for us to say that by trying to expand the universe, they somehow managed to make it a whole lot smaller, robbing it of mystery and scope. As Nintendo have stayed within the framework of the original 4 games, meddling and adding titles between them, a lot of motives, stories, and messages seem to have been muddied somewhat. The Metroids return a ridiculous amount of times in the Prime games, making it really hard to believe that they're all exterminated by the end of Metroid 2. The way the Federation in Metroid Prime 3 uses weapons harnessed by the power of a dangerous nuclear substance makes Samus' involvement with them seem even more careless and strange by the time of Fusion. Samus no longer just enters the caverns of a distant planet, it's her childhood home now, and she has the added intention of revenge for the murder of both her biological and adoptive families. There's even another evil doppelganger that harasses Samus a bunch. The constant recursion of motifs makes the overarching narrative increasingly comical, like the Metroids being back again and again is treated with the same gravitas as Donkey Kong's banana hoard being stolen once more. And while Donkey Kong is a goofy monkey who can reclaim his bananas again for all eternity without it getting old, the Metroid series is at least intended to be viewed through some air of seriosity. But that's not where we are. We're at banana horde level now. And don't get us wrong, these are fine games on their own. We're not pissy about the shitty lore of Metroid. It doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. But it is kind of unfortunate how much of the stuff added on top of the old games rather seems to detract from them. It's sort of a perfect example of when additional lore simply obfuscates from what is really important. They went in and tried to fix something that wasn't broken to begin with, explain things that did not need explaining, reveal things that probably shouldn't have been revealed. Like, did we really need to know how Samus got the big shoulders in Metroid Prime? Does anyone care? Most of that crap isn't even in the games themselves, creating a whole different problem for anyone just casually playing these games and not wanting to be really weird about it. Or perhaps ignorant bliss is the way to go. The mystery usually is a lot more interesting than the answer after all. What we're trying to say is that the Metroid games are good. But the tacked on lore is absolute horseshit. It's basically a bunch of junk that has been duct taped onto what is already there in the hope that no one will notice the shoddy construction. It's a flimsy mess that only serves to make the cohesive narrative of the original 4 games just that little bit worse off. And you don't have to agree, of course, but perhaps we can still convince you with the crowning achievement of expanded universe meddling, the tippy top of the trash fire sundae, Sakamoto's magnum opus, Metroid Other M.
Remember me?
That's fucking terrible. Itadakimasu, Samus-chan! When a lot of people, well, not a lot of people, when a few people talk about Metroid Other M, they seem a bit confused about where the heck it came from. But with our brief overview, it should be very clear that this is the inevitable conclusion of almost a decade of fixing Metroid. 8 years of incessant and needless fiddling. It adds, retracts, contradicts, and messes with basically everything except the pinball game. The retconning of earlier titles during this period was deceptively subtle in execution, to the point where you probably didn't even notice it. Easy stuff to ignore while enjoying some good games for the most part. Metroid Other M, on the other hand, dives headfirst into the indulgent anus of revisionism, so blatant that no one could ignore its merciless rampaging. Metroid Other M is more story-focused than any of the other games in the series. It takes the lore dump from the Japanese manga you haven't read, assumes that you have read it, and then expands upon it. It adds motivation and justification for what Samus has done in previous games in a way that feels really distracting, especially all the parts where the game wants to especially emphasize that Samus is indeed a woman, with the flagrant nods towards motherhood and birth. Samus contemplates the baby Metroid's death in Super Metroid and is soon thereafter sent a distress signal called the baby's cry from the bottle ship. Like, I'd never expect Samus to be distraught about a space jellyfish exploding after being shot by Godzilla because of her maternal instincts. But what should I really have expected from a series that is selling the Zero Suit based on sex appeal and repeatedly has offered increasingly more naked pictures of the protagonist as rewards? Metroid is just weird about women, I guess. With how Metroid Other M shotgun fires lore and frankly adds too much baggage onto the originals, it's quite emblematic of the issues we have with the overall treatment of the once flawlessly simplistic narrative of Metroid. It is troubled by the unfortunate circumstance of being sandwiched right in between the 2 most important entries in the entire franchise. It's a narrative sequel to the all-time classic Super Metroid, while also being a prequel to the prolific Metroid Fusion. And it tries its very darndest to flesh out what happened in between the 2 games with meaningful events that expand upon Samus as a complex emotional character, mostly through her troubled relationship to
The baby.
Ridley, and of course her previous commanding officer Adam Malkovich, before and after he blows up. And it does make sense to some extent. After all, it glances heavily over at how Metroid Fusion previously established Samus as a real-ass person, had her express opinions and thoughts about the situations at hand, and Other M at least tries to take that a few steps further. Bless its heart. The problem is that it's not very convincing at all. There is little emotional connection to the events that take place, nor any of the characters. The most believable being the newcomer and best boy Anthony, who is the only one who could indeed be seen as a friend to Samus. In Fusion, Adam was presented as a good friend too, or at least that's what Samus said. But here, their relationship is instead escalated to what could be considered bordering on abusive at times. It could be that Samus has simply been gaslighted into believing a lie about the dude, But considering how the music swells when he shoots her in the back to do his unnecessary heroic sacrifice, we doubt that is what they were actually going for. It does, however, make the reunion with Adam in Fusion come off as rather strange and uncomfortable. What's especially egregious about Metroid Other M in regards to the overarching narrative is how it repeats key events of Metroid Fusion without much thought about the implications of doing so. There are the more superficial connections, like how the game is set on a biological research station, with sectors mimicking different environments for creatures to inhabit, and Samus takes orders from her old friend Adam throughout her mission. But most importantly, there is a government conspiracy to clone Metroids and rapidly evolve them. Although this plan is a bit more extensive this time, as they are cloning and experimenting on everything from Sebastians to whatever the heck a Ridley is. They didn't even know it was a Ridley, and now they're dead. What a bunch of losers! Samus then stops them and walks away angrily, while the Federation army is exposed for being corrupt. This is somehow meant to be clever. It mirrors Fusion in such detail that it's clear it has some kind of intention of expressing something with that parallel. We're just not entirely sure what though. I guess it's like poetry, so it rhymes. At best, the repetition makes Samus look like a complete idiot for ever working with the Federation again, and at worst, it completely diminishes the impact of Metroid Fusion and almost leaves it meaningless in the grand scheme of things. Fusion was a reflection on the series so far. It was about revelations and examining the questionable messages inferred by the formula. Other M borrows the surface level aspects and forces itself onto Fusion and demands they both be equals. There's a pervading impression that it's obviously assuming a familiarity with Fusion, while also pretty much being a misguided replacement of that game. In this way, Other M feels like it paradoxically requires you to be a Fusion fan, and that you've also never played Fusion and never ever will. It's nothing short of a baffling mess. Who is this for? It's kinda like the X-Parasite copy of Fusion, just an empty husk with nothing inside but a pathetic little gooey blob infecting everything it touches. Metroid Other M is a pretty extreme example of how the expanded lore goes about fixing things in the already established story. But while extreme, it is simply the culmination of everything that has come before it. It's a symptom, but not the disease itself. With time, things have been added on top of the Metroid Foundation, and at this point, it is on the metaphorical verge of caving in on itself. What should have been simple and straightforward is now confused and obfuscated by superfluous extras that don't really add much value. At the end of the day, Metroid started out as a quaint space game with a trans woman protagonist and a few narrative puzzle pieces to play around with. While the next 3 games certainly evolved and changed a few things along the way, they never lost sight of what truly mattered: the mysterious atmosphere and the vast unknown. It wasn't that important to explain everything outright. A lot of the details were better left to the grand imagination of the player. The strange statues littered throughout the ruins of planet Sebes spoke of deep secrets and ancient times we would never truly know. Who made them? What were they for? How long ago were they built? Oh wait, there's a plaque. Let me scan it.
Recording to logbook.
Only one thing is alive and well here. Evil. And it must be destroyed. Decimated. Exterminated.
The narrative of Metroid just isn't the same anymore. It has been altered and tweaked so much that the perspective of the entire franchise has shifted in quite interesting ways over time. Most people are probably not playing the games from 1 to 4 in the original release order anymore. The accepted understanding seems to be that both Metroid and Metroid 2 can be skipped entirely in favor of the more modern remakes. And while that is perfectly fine, of course, we think it is worth to at least consider not only the benefits, but also what might be lost by doing so. I mean, just think about it. It's inevitable that the experience will be affected by starting with 2 remakes that, while faithful in a lot of ways, add things and are made in such different times that they're not just simple replacements. Zero Mission, for example, is just as much a narrative remake of the original NES game as it is the mechanical sequel to Fusion. It's even fair to call it the last in the line of classic 2D Metroid games. Is that really the unequivocal best place to start? Zero Mission is a game from 2004. It's the pinnacle of everything that the developers had learned from the franchise so far, a swan song for the by then classic 2D formula. It's not the first Metroid game, because it cannot be. It's the natural evolution of the series up to that point, and you can see that through everything from graphic identity to mechanical refinement. The stealth sections are clearly extensions of the ideas presented in Fusion's SAX encounters, and hints towards what would one day become Metroid Dread. What we're trying to get at is that there is a lot of context surrounding these games that is inherently tied to when they were made and what they followed up from. There is a logical progression in the sense of narrative, mechanics, and core ideas that we find very interesting, and that might not come across as well when we assume that starting with Zero Mission, going to Samus Returns, and then back to Super Metroid presents this same thing that the originals did. Add on top of that the manga, the Prime Games, Federation Force, as well as other and suddenly experiencing these games in chronological order based on a supposed timeline just doesn't make much sense anymore. At least not if you want the clearest picture possible of where it all began and how we got to the point where we are today. It completely destroys the narrative cohesion. The same goes for the simplicity that once graced the series and gave it both scope and reason to wonder what was really out there. It's more fun to think about who Adam Malkovich or the Chozo were than to actually know the truth. Partly because it eliminates possibilities, maybe it's a bit disappointing even, but also because it makes everything just that tiny little bit less mysterious. Reading the manga doesn't really give us what we love Metroid for. The answers are not as satisfying as our own imagination, or even just falling into the deep unknown. It's honestly a bit vapid to us. And yeah, transparency hates lore, what a shocker. But that is actually not true. Despite everything we've said so far, we think that the original 4 Metroid games have what we'd consider to be the best kind of lore. The kind that doesn't say too much. The stuff that makes you think and speculate. Isn't that the stuff that people in the lore business love so freaking much? Metroid's environmental storytelling is absolutely excellent. World-class stuff. And after all, they kinda wrote the playbook. The eerie Chozo statues that have been left to crumble. Whatever could have happened here? Have you ever wondered who this goober outside of Kraid's lair was? Who in the world could have crash landed this ship here? How did the frozen corpse of Ridley end up inside of a Federation-funded research station? These are all pretty cool things that you can have fun speculating about all day. But you don't necessarily need other games to explain these things to you on any deeper level. Sometimes it's nice to ask questions without getting a response, you know. Furthermore, when the Metroid franchise falls in on itself like this, there are issues of cohesion that emerge in ideological ways. A rather telling observation is how everything laid out in the first Metroid and its manual are still the core factors to the Metroid universe. Samus, Metroids, Galactic Federation, SR-388, Sebes, Space Pirates, Ridley, Mother Brain, that one ancient civilization. It was all there in one shape or form from day one, and not much has appeared since to really graft itself onto this ecosystem. Rather, we have mostly received an increasing amount of arrows between the key points. It's structurally stagnant, but primarily, it's cheap. Making Samus connected to all of the factors that initially felt incidental makes the universe smaller and converts the portrayed events into something prophetic, like fate. Likewise, the Chozo no longer being a strange alien race that disappeared a long time ago drains the worlds of their mystery. Instead, they have been drastically repositioned as something surprisingly recent and comprehensible. I get the impression that this was done to further establish a balance between good and evil in the galaxy. The Chozo statues gave Samus power-ups, so those are interpreted as forces of good that connect to her backstory. Where did she get her spacesuit? Well, she grew up with the Chozo and they gave it to her, you big idiot. As such, the pirates are presented as even more malign when the power dynamic is a Chozo genocide on Sebes to take over the planet as their base. It realigns the troubled morality that had previously been so core to the series' thematic growth into once again being one of black and whites. In that way, it's borderline condescending that the marketing hook for Dread's narrative is the twist of a potentially naughty Chozo. Like, of course the Chozo had morality. This is only a shocker because you intently simplified their characterization previously. What this is to say is that the conflicting push and pull on the franchise over the years makes for a mess of whiplash proportions when presented in that coveted timeline order. Even when disregarding most of the side games, the fact that the presented world balance shifts back and forth on a per game basis is jarring to say the least. Honestly, doing the substituted main series run through that's seemingly positioned as the new default feels more like some wild thought experiment than a sensible recommendation. It's only assumed logical because it has a deceptive 1, 2, 3, 4 progression, with the most recent entry for every position. In this view, story is literal and replaceable if it still hits the same key notes. We don't need to tell you how short-sighted that is. But don't be fooled. You don't need silly YouTubers or article writers to tell you where you have to begin your Metroid journey. Truthfully, you can start off wherever you want and probably be fine. Most of the games are good after all. But if you want a full-fledged, transparency-approved Metroid experience, we'd suggest playing them in release order. And our reasoning for that is quite simple. This way you can see the logical progression of the series happening right before your eyes, probably understand what choices were made, why they were made, and possibly even get a greater appreciation for what went into all of that. This is, again, not to claim that this is the only true way of experiencing the Metroid franchise. It's not a guide for how you should start, because at this point it's all subjective anyway. But if you have never played the games this way before, then we think it is worth a shot. Try to scrub your mind clean from what you know, experience them for what they were there and then, read the manuals and take in the atmosphere from a time when things were still much more simple, yet grand. So, right about now, we guess some of you are asking yourselves, what do the old games have that the remakes don't? And that's really not a bad question, because our incessant insistence on these games being valuable in their own right is probably unusual and a bit non-apparent in its intention. Basically, it all goes back to Metroid Fusion, because of course it does. We feel the narrative of that game only really functions with the original progression of the franchise. How it grew increasingly complicated and conscious with each take, and how the culmination in Fusion is cohesive in everything from writing to aesthetics. A game like the original Metroid with its almost infantile morality and lack of context only really functions as an NES game, because it's a bare-bones narrative that is brought to flesh by subsequent events. It is actively legitimized by its successors, and that makes the sobering fallout so much more effective. The simplistic presentation is unassuming at the moment, and recontextualized as distortion in hindsight. It's not vile in 8-bit, but the awkwardness in still pertaining to it decades later is. In Zero Mission, the silent crusade for the Galactic Federation has been rewritten as one of personal stakes that ends in sentimentality for and vindication by Samus' new Chozo heritage. If Fusion problematizes the former, the latter makes that point irrelevant. It's highly detrimental. This applies equally to Metroid 2, but we would also want to highlight how the emergence of conscious in its conclusion is severely unappreciated for how radical it actually was for its time. The impact of Samus sparing the Metroid baby back in 1991 was equal to if Super Mario Bros. Had ended with Mario saving the last Goomba and being like, "You're my son now!" It's an actually shocking surprise in context, not just that it happens, but in how sincere it is. We don't get that if Samus is previously established as an empathetic character with personal stakes, childhood memories and grief. Then it's just, of course Samus would save the little baby guy. Her gay bird dads probably even told her that spare Metroids are good to have around just in case. There's no dormant sins and ghost in the closet if Samus was always righteous in her cause. It honestly makes Fusion surprisingly flat if you don't infer that Samus has done something wrong by just being the way she was. But that's what the remakes and expanded lore ultimately contribute. They present a revised and sugar-coated new introduction to the series that completely muddies the motives and intentions. Shoehorning in the X-Parasites as early as lore demands it not only lessens the impact and framing of Fusion, but arguably obfuscates the conclusion of 2 more than Ridley's surprise Prime reunion party. If the original point was to highlight a break from the constant violence into a gentle last stretch of redemption, it has now been replaced with the never-ending pathetic struggle for power and control of the universe. We can't even pretend the galaxy was ever at peace anymore. Our biggest contention here should be quite obvious by now. Metroid Fusion was the culmination of the narrative ideas that had been weaved in the series so far, and it is without a doubt the best one in our eyes. And that relates heavily to how it took what had already been established and came to a conclusion. But that conclusion has only been diminished and made more obsolete with time. To fully appreciate it, you need to make some active choices in your reading, because what that game achieved was probably too drastically self-critical to be sustainable. And as such, the rest of the franchise practically bullied it into irrelevance. Really, the issue with Fusion isn't that it presents such a bold take on Metroid that it's impossible to avoid with any trace of dignity. It's that Nintendo clearly didn't give a crap about what the message of that game even was. The lingering feeling after finishing Fusion is the thought that this is it. This is the last one. You can't make any more after this. And that's not necessarily because it's hard to shove more Metroids into the timeline after it. It's rather the critical angle that pervades the entire experience. If Metroid has been exposed as a juvenile power fantasy of killing things and being a government lapdog, it would paint any form of uncritical return to this system as emotionally insincere and ideologically daft. But here we are, I guess. One other M later, like a drunken face tattoo that will never go away, no matter how much you will it. You can't ignore it. It's there now. It cannot be undone. Even if you are actively discrediting it from the canon, you still have to acknowledge it by doing so. However, no matter how much Other M and its cronies reshape the future of the series, they cannot alter the past. Metroid Fusion cannot be ruined, because that game will always be excellent on its own. It's reassuring to know that its uncomfortable self-awareness will always be apparent when taken in context. The clues will be there for anyone to connect the dots and figure this out. In the end, the human soul will ever reach for the truth.
Thanks for watching. Sorry for the delay, but this was quite an undertaking. Lots of stuff behind the scenes. If you'd like to hear about that, you can listen to the audio companion available for all tiers on Patreon. Speaking of, here they are. Andrew Jones, Loke, All-Purpose Nobody, Athayet, Ben Clark, Bibi the Bitch, Colt of the Hyena, Ember, Emrasa, Gage McColgan, Joel Nilsson, Claes Morales, Matthias Grahman, Meowmix64, Mosling, Nate Kiernan, Nishvat, Raid of the Stars, TV Skyen, Vox, Abigail Nail, Amanda Rönne Idenge, Andreas, Eric Parkinson, Basklin, Bill Moran, Botch Frivar, Charles Goldhaber, Chloe Strange, Eli Bermas, Femoral Mist, Fluffquist, Indigo Trance, Linen, Marika, Marby, Max Miller, Mitch Haley, Nathan Schaaf, Never Haunting You, Revocus Magma, Scott from Nerdsync, Zilla Rookie, Skyhoppers, Sweet Pink, Sivar Vegata, Tobias Mattsson, Ouija, Wimson, and C33. Also, we actually forgot to read the new patrons last video. Oops. So this is 2 months worth. Here goes. Alison McHugh, Ariel Pina, Colin Ungerlader, Craig Bonder, Evan Teague, Forpush, Gavin Daphne King, Calvin Ram, Rosemary, Sandman, and Tyler Leto. If you'd like to join these lovely ghosts, you yourself can also become a patron. Check out that link and get access to our Discord, the audio companions, sneak peeks, and more. Here's hoping Metroid Dread doesn't screw attack everything we have said. Oh gosh, do we need to make another Fusion-like Metroid video?